Hello there. Today, I'd like to have a literary chat with you about one of my favourite writers, the novelist Jane Austen. This is going to be a short history of Austen's life and a brief exploration of her style of writing. However, I'm not going to go into too much detail about her individual novels because honestly, I feel that each of them is wonderful enough to deserve a video of its own. So, depending on how much interest there is in this topic, I will make further specific videos that are dedicated to each of her novels. For now, let's begin by looking at Austen's life and the world she inhabited. There will be a few accompanying illustrations on the video, but it's not essential for you to view them. If you prefer, you can simply settle back, close your eyes and relax, while my voice takes you into the world of Jane Austen. Austen was born in December 1775 in Steventon, which is a small village in southern England in the county of Hampshire. She was the daughter of George Austen, a clergyman, and Cassandra Austen, who had been Cassandra Lee before her marriage and was herself the daughter of another clergyman. George and Cassandra had met in Oxford while George had been studying for his degree and where Cassandra's father was a college rector. And I think it's worth taking a few moments to describe their situation in life because it has quite a bearing on Jane Austen's own circumstances and on the themes she would write about in her novels. Both George Austen and Cassandra Lee came from very respectable families that belonged to the gentry, which means that they both came from families that owned property and land, and therefore enjoyed fairly elevated social positions. In the 18th century, the middle class, as we now know it, was only just beginning to emerge. Back then, it was called the trade class because it was made up of people who earned their money by following a specific trade. And although tradesmen might become very successful and very wealthy, they were still considered to be socially inferior to the gentry. The gentry, by contrast, were considered to be of a higher social class, just below the nobility in fact. But in reality, many of them didn't have much money at all, and this was the case with the Austens. Although both George and Cassandra came from well-connected families, they were both from the younger branches of those families, which meant their parents hadn't inherited any of the main family wealth or land. This was quite a common situation at the time. Where families were large, all the money and property would usually be inherited by the eldest son, which meant that while the younger sons would be well educated and raised as gentlemen, they wouldn't actually inherit much wealth. And if they had several children of their own, their younger sons would inherit even less, and so on through the generations. As for the girls, they usually didn't inherit anything at all, or at least nothing more than a token sum, unless they were only children or their parents were extremely wealthy. Both George and Cassandra Austen benefited from relations who had property and wealth, but they also both came from relatively poor branches of their respective families. This was more the case with George than with Cassandra. He, in fact, was only able to receive a gentleman's education because his wealthier uncle Francis paid for his schooling and Oxford tuition. He became a member of the clergy because this was considered to be one of the few genteel professions that a younger son could adopt without compromising his social position or falling into the trade class, so it was a popular choice with poorer members of the gentry. George Austen ended up becoming the rector of 2 different parishes, which meant his income was slightly larger, and in addition, his rectory house at Steventon, which came with a job, had land that he was able to farm in order to raise a bit more money. George also took in pupils, the sons of other gentlemen, and often had 3 or 4 boys boarding at the rectory, so that the house became a sort of small private school. In this way, the Austens were able to maintain their social standing, but it was, nevertheless, quite a precarious position to be in. Even with all his various streams of income, George had to raise his family on an extremely modest sum, and so the Austens relied heavily on the generosity of their wealthier cousins for many of their enjoyments and treats. This sense of social precariousness is often reflected in Jane Austen's novels. In more than one of her stories, the heroine, or heroines, belongs to a family that is genteel and educated, but doesn't have much money. And the insecurity and anxiety this generates among the family members is very convincingly portrayed. Into this pleasant but precarious world, Jane Austen was born. The Austens had 8 children in total, and Jane was the 7th, and also the youngest girl. As a child, she was surrounded by boys, for as well as having 6 brothers, she would also play with her father's school boarders, and this perhaps made her more fearless and precocious than the average clergyman's daughter. In one of her novels, Northanger Abbey, she describes the young heroine Catherine Morland as someone who was fond of all boys' plays and greatly preferred cricket to dolls. She was, moreover, noisy and wild, hated confinement and cleanliness, and loved nothing so well in the world as rolling down the green slope at the back of the house. There is such a relish in this description that I can't help but wonder if Austen is perhaps describing some of her own youthful traits in this character portrait. What is certain is that her creative precociousness was encouraged by her family, especially by her father. The Austens would often stage family theatricals, and Jane wrote 3 short plays for her family to perform. She also, from the age of 11 onwards, wrote stories and parodies for their entertainment, which allowed her to explore her talent as a writer and hone the satirical wit for which she would later become famous. She wrote The History of England, a comic parody of scholarly history books, when she was just 14 years old. And when she was 18, she began work on her first novel, Lady Susan. This manuscript was never published during her lifetime, but by the time she was 21, she was working on another 2 novels, one called Eleanor and Marianne, which would later become the basis for Sense and Sensibility, and one called First Impressions, which would later turn into Pride and Prejudice. Her father enjoyed First Impressions so much that he tried to get it published. And although his attempt failed, I think that having such a high level of enthusiasm and practical support from her father must have greatly encouraged the young Jane. George Austen then offered her 4th novel, Northanger Abbey, to the London publisher Benjamin Cosby, and this time it was accepted for publication. Cosby paid £10 for the manuscript, which was the equivalent of about £400 today, but he never actually published the novel. Eventually, the Austen family were forced to buy it back once Jane had become a successful author. It's possible that, given this generous early output, Jane's breakthrough publishing moment could have happened fairly soon after Northanger Abbey, had she kept writing at the same prodigious rate. However, in the year 1800, her father made a decision that, unwittingly, set her literary career back by nearly a full decade. He decided to retire from the clergy and pass on the Steventon rectory to his son James, who was also now a minister. Jane had to give up her beloved family home and move with her parents to Bath, which she hated. Some biographers have claimed that this change in her circumstances brought on a depression that made it difficult for Austen to write. And whether this is true or not, it's certainly the case that between 1800 and 1810, during a time of great family upheaval, she didn't write much at all. Her unhappiness in Bath was exacerbated 5 years later when, in 1805, her father died suddenly at the age of 73. As well as grieving for their loss, the family were also undone financially because the small income that George Austen had received as a retired clergyman ended with his death. Jane, her mother, and her sister Cassandra had to give up their Bath residence, and for nearly 5 years they relied on the kindness and charity of their relations, moving first to smaller lodgings in Bath, then to a cottage in Sussex, and then to another cottage in Southampton. It was an unsettled and insecure life, and during this time, unsurprisingly, Jane did not write. One way that she could have secured a more settled life for herself was through marriage, and before her father had died, Jane had received a proposal. In 1802, Harris Bigwither, the brother of 2 of her friends, had asked her to marry him. At first, Jane accepted the proposal, but then the following day, she changed her mind and withdrew it. Her reasons for doing so aren't known, but it's often speculated that she agreed to marry out of pragmatic considerations, because Harris Bigwither was a man of some property and wealth who could have provided security for all the Austen women. But then, having slept on it, she decided she couldn't go through with the marriage because she didn't really care for her suitor. Whatever the reasons for her refusal, after the death of Jane's father, her status as an unmarried woman, with a similarly single sister and a widowed mother, left Jane in very difficult domestic circumstances. Fortunately, her brothers united to contribute to the upkeep of their mother and sisters, and by 1809, one brother in particular, Edward, was able to provide them with a settled family home. At the age of 12, Edward had been unofficially adopted by some relations of his father, who were both very wealthy and childless. In time, they made him their legal heir, and from them he inherited no less than 3 country house estates, at Godmersham in Kent and Steventon and Chawton in Hampshire. His younger brother James still lived at the rectory at Steventon with his own family, but at Chawton there was a large cottage close to the main house where the Austen women were able to settle down to a more peaceful and secure existence. The cottage at Chawton would remain Jane's home for the next 8 years, and during this short period, she experienced a second spring as a writer. Her first novel to be published was the reworked Sense and Sensibility in 1811, and it was an instant success, gaining positive reviews and requiring a second print run. It was published anonymously, described simply as being by a lady, and all of her subsequent novels were also published as being by the author of Sense and Sensibility. Austen received a total of £140 for this novel, which was about £5,000 by today's standards. This wasn't a lot, but it gave Jane the confidence to continue. Pride and Prejudice was published 2 years later, in 1813, and by 1814 she had written and published Mansfield Park. Emma followed a year later, in 1815, and by 1817 the first draft of Persuasion was finished. Here, however, Austen's writing career came to an abrupt end. She had started to feel ill in 1816, and by the spring of 1817 her brother Charles had moved her into lodgings in Winchester so that she could be near her physician. It's not known precisely what illness she was suffering from. but Austen died at the age of 41 on the 18th of July 1817. Her early loss as a daughter and sister must have been great, but her literary loss is perhaps even greater. Northanger Abbey and Persuasion were published posthumously in 1818, but we will never know how many more wonderful novels she might have gifted to the world had she lived into old age. As a writer, Austen is celebrated for her talent for characterization. By this, I mean that her stories are developed and driven forward by the personalities of the people she writes about. Austen rarely resorts to melodrama or exaggeration. She doesn't need to throw in random plot devices, such as murders, robberies, or unlikely adventures, in order to create challenges for her characters, because she has enough understanding of human nature to know that often the obstacles faced by people tend to be of their own making. Just as in real life, it is the personalities of Austen's heroines and heroes, how they view the world and how they view their own place within it, that drives their reactions to the people they meet and the situations they encounter. And in turn, it is those reactions that develop into consequences and drive the story forward. This psychological insight into how a person's character, thoughts, and temperament ultimately shapes their path through life gives Austen's novels a great deal of realism and allows her to create a very lifelike and three-dimensional set of characters, which is one of the aspects of her work that I and many other Austen fans enjoy the most. She was able to create these lifelike characterizations by being incredibly observant of the small details and quirks that make up a person's character. For this reason, perhaps, all her novels are set in a very similar world to the one she inhabited herself, the world that she could observe most accurately and therefore write about most truthfully. These confined settings for her novels have led to criticism from some literary commentators who object to the fact that she focused on such a narrow field of society. However, my personal feeling is that this restriction is one of her great strengths as a writer, because by sticking to the world she knew, she was able to analyse it in minute detail, and consequently create very authentic and believable characters. It's true that her field is narrow, but that is because, as an unmarried gentlewoman living in the late 18th and early 19th century, only a very narrow field of society was open to her. However, within those limitations, she managed to observe and delineate an incredible array of human emotions and behaviours, and to do so with an immense amount of perception. I doubt those perceptions would have been so truthful or so profound if she hadn't limited herself to the world she understood so well. Being such an acute observer of human character also makes Austen a witty and satirical writer, because she sees all of the foibles and follies in human nature and takes some delight in mocking them. Satire is a particular type of humour in which wit is employed specifically to expose and ridicule the flaws of those who have power, be it political power, social power, or financial power. Austen uses her acute observational skills and her great wit to skewer those who possess great social or financial advantage but don't exercise equal amounts of kindness or intelligence. The aristocracy, in particular, are frequently the victims of her sly character assassinations. She reserves her sharpest satire for characters such as Lady Catherine de Bourgh in Pride and Prejudice and Sir Walter Elliot in Persuasion, who have wealth or status or both, but are also mean or vain or stupid. Austen also takes great delight in lampooning the ambitions of those who are slightly lower down the social ladder, but are desperate to climb climb up it at any cost. Characters such as Mrs. Elton in Emma or Isabella Thorpe in Northanger Abbey are satirized because they abandon all integrity and honesty in their attempts to get on in the world. As well as being very witty and satirical, Austen's novels are also charming. In the fictional worlds she creates, avarice and vanity are frequently punished, and those who have good hearts and considerate minds always tend to come out on top, which makes for very satisfying endings. These endings also always involve a marriage, and that has led to Austen being considered by many as a conventionally romantic writer. There's no doubt that Austen does make a point of ensuring that most, although not all, of her heroines marry for love. But in doing this, I don't think she is being conventional, but rather incredibly radical. Many of her protagonists, especially those in her early novels, are young women who find themselves in a similar position to Austen herself, clinging to their social position within the gentry by the slimmest means, without any way of earning a living or bettering their circumstances, except through marriage. For many of the women who were balanced on the brink of gentility, marriages often weren't romantic. They were practical transactions, made to further family connections, gain wealth, or consolidate status. So for Jane Austen to allow her heroines to marry for love was actually quite a subversive step at the time. She was showing her contemporary female readers a different way of thinking about marriage, one that put their own happiness above the pragmatic considerations of their families or the society they lived in. Seen in this light, the love matches in Austen's novels become rather rebellious, I think. Today, they might seem conventionally romantic, but at the time when she was writing, the romance aspect of her novels could be viewed as a critique of the society she inhabited, where a woman's destiny was solely dependent on her making a good match. It's also worth remembering that marriage was the only viable occupation for women in Austen's position, because they weren't able to pursue any of the professions that were open to their brothers. The only paid work that was considered permissible for a gentlewoman, if she needed to earn her own living, was to serve as a governess to the children of an affluent family. But even this job denoted a loss of status, and in reality, the work was so poorly paid and often involved such deprivation that very few women would choose it as a career if they had any other choice. Even the occupation of writing, which Austen chose for herself, was still considered to be slightly shady. That's why she published her works anonymously and kept her literary activity hidden from many of her friends. Through the success of her novels, she helped to dispel some of this shadiness for the next generation of women writers who would follow her. But in her own lifetime, being a woman writer was sufficiently dubious for her not to wish to reveal her occupation, or to bestow the same fate on any of her characters. The acute restriction of opportunities for women goes a long way to explaining why most of the ladies in Austen's novels, not just the protagonists, but also the supporting characters as well, are often preoccupied with the question of marriage. It was an important social and economic step, because a bad or low marriage could lead to a woman falling out of gentility, whereas a good marriage could raise her wealth and status significantly. We see an example of this in the novel Mansfield Park, in which two sisters marry, one to a baronet and one to a poor naval officer. Maria Ward becomes Lady Bertram and lives surrounded by comfort and splendour at Mansfield Park, whereas her sister, Frances, ends up living a very confined life in a cramped house in Portsmouth that is really only just on the right side of respectability by Georgian standards. Just as the pursuit of a successful career or an adventurous destiny is frequently at the heart of many novels written by men during this era, so it is that marriage, the only career or adventure open to a woman, is frequently at the heart of Austen's work. However, because she was an observant, truthful writer, we see many different types of marriage depicted in her stories. While she does write about marriages that are successful and contain love and kindness, she also depicts marriages that contain great unhappiness, selfishness, and coldness. Through her characters, Austen shows us the truth about married life, just as she shows us the truth about many aspects of human behaviour. And in doing so, she creates worlds that may sometimes be romantic, but are also compelling in their authenticity. Another aspect of Austen's writing that I would like to mention briefly is her ability to write a good detective plotline, by which I don't mean that she wrote actual detective stories, but that there are sometimes strands in her novels that keep the reader guessing, or that develop into quite surprising plot twists. I don't want to spoil anyone's enjoyment by giving these plot twists away, but they tend to arise, like most of the brilliance in Austen's writing, from her ability to observe and develop characters in a very realistic way. Some of her characters are deceitful. They tell lies or conceal the truth for their own selfish reasons. And Austen writes these characters so well and makes them so plausible that, as well as hoodwinking the other characters in the story, they also sometimes manage to hoodwink the reader. This lends an extra layer of ingenuity and entertainment to the novels that I, for one, really enjoy. If you haven't read any of Austen's work and want to start now, then the book that many people begin with is Pride and Prejudice, which is probably her most famous and popular novel. There are also many film and television adaptations of her books, and these can be an entertaining introduction, although they do tend to dwell very heavily on the romance aspect of her work, and some of them are not so faithful to the original stories. However, most of them are good fun to watch, and are an accessible way to introduce yourself to Jane Austen's work. There are also several biographies that have been written about her, and if you're in the UK, you can even visit her house. The cottage at Chawton, where Austen lived in her final years and wrote so many of her wonderful novels, is now a museum dedicated to her life and work. I'll put a link for it in the description below this video, as well as some other links that I suspect my fellow Jane Austen fans might enjoy. That's the end of our literary chat about Jane Austen. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this brief history of her life and work, and that it's inspired you to explore or perhaps revisit her novels. Thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you again soon for another ASMR audio adventure. Until then, goodbye.